the Keeper of Shadows. At the end of a lonely, winding road in a town few dared to visit, there stood an ancient house, known only as Blackthorn Manor. Its crumbling facade, shrouded in the overgrowth of twisted vines and darkened by centuries of neglect, mirrored the secrets it held within. The townsfolk spoke of it in hushed whispers, and for years no one had dared approach it, save for one man, old Jeremiah. Jeremiah had lived in Blackthorn Manor for as long as anyone could remember, a frail figure with silver hair that hung in wild strands around his gaunt face. His eyes were said to burn with the intensity of someone who had witnessed too much. He was rarely seen outside his home, and when he was, it was only to visit the small general store at the edge of town to purchase provisions, never speaking more than a few curt words to the shopkeeper. But despite his reclusive nature, the rumors about him swirled like autumn leaves on the wind. Some said Jeremiah was a murderer hiding from a dark past. Others whispered that he had made a pact with the devil himself, sealing his soul in exchange for a cursed immortality. No one knew for sure, and no one cared to find out, until the day Amelia arrived in town. The curious stranger. Amelia Daniels was a young journalist from the city, sent on assignment to uncover the most haunted places in the country for an upcoming article. She was fearless, at least that's what she told herself, and had always been drawn to the strange and unexplained. When she heard about Blackthorn Manor and its enigmatic resident, she knew she had found her story. Amelia parked her car near the general store, its wooden sign creaking in the breeze, and stepped inside. The shopkeeper, a hunched old man named George, eyed her with suspicion as she approached the counter. "Excuse me," Amelia began, trying to sound casual. "I'm looking for someone. An old man named Jeremiah lives up at Blackthorn Manor." George's face paled at the mention of the name, and he immediately busied himself rearranging the items on the counter. "Ain't no one's business but his own," he muttered, refusing to meet her gaze. Amelia leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "I'm writing an article, and I've heard some interesting stories about him. I just want to talk." George stopped his fidgeting and looked her square in the eye, his voice grave. "If you're wise, miss, you'll leave that place alone. Ain't nothing good come out of there. Not for a long time." But Amelia was not one to be easily deterred. She thanked George and left the store, her curiosity piqued even further. The sun was already dipping below the horizon as she made her way up the old road to Blackthorn Manor, the trees on either side casting long, skeletal shadows across her path. When she finally arrived at the gates of the manor, her breath caught in her throat. The house was even more foreboding than she had imagined. Its windows were dark, like empty eyes watching her every move, and the air around it felt thick, oppressive, as if the very ground beneath her feet was waiting to swallow her whole. She took a deep breath and pushed open the creaking gate. The gravel path crunched under her feet as she approached the front door, her heart pounding in her chest. She raised her hand to knock, but before she could, the door slowly opened with a groan. Jeremiah stood in the doorway, his piercing eyes locking onto hers. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice as rough as the wind that howled through the trees. But he stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The inside of Blackthorn Manor was just as dark and decayed as the outside. The walls were lined with faded portraits, their eyes following Amelia as she moved through the dimly lit hallway. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. Jeremiah led her to a small sitting room where a fire crackled weakly in the hearth. He gestured for her to sit, then took a seat opposite her, his bony hands resting on his knees. "So, you've come to hear my story," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Amelia nodded, her notepad at the ready. Yes. People in town say you've been living here for a long time. Some say you've seen things, done things. Jeremiah's lips curled into a bitter smile. People say many things, but most of them don't know what they're talking about. Amelia leaned forward, intrigued. Then tell me what really happened. For a long moment, Jeremiah said nothing. His eyes seemed to lose focus, staring into the flames as if they held the memories of a past long buried. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, haunted. It was over 50 years ago. I was a young man then, full of ambition. I came here to Blackthorn Manor after the death of my father, inheriting the family estate. But there was something wrong with this place from the very beginning. I could feel it, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The nights were the worst. I'd hear things, whispers in the walls, footsteps in the halls, though I was the only one here. Jeremiah paused, his hands trembling slightly. But it wasn't until I found the basement that I understood the true horror of this place. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. The basement? What did you find? Jeremiah's eyes darkened, and he leaned forward, his voice lowering to a near growl. I found the truth. This house, it was built on a cursed land, long before my family ever owned it. The original owner, a man named Alistair Blackthorn, was a practitioner of dark magic, rituals that required sacrifices, human sacrifices. Amelia shuddered as Jeremiah continued. I discovered an old journal in the attic filled with Blackthorn's writings. He spoke of opening a doorway, a gateway to another realm, a realm of shadows where unspeakable things dwelled. He believed that by feeding them, he could gain power beyond comprehension. Jeremiah's voice cracked as he spoke the next words, but the gateway was never closed, and when I found it down there in the basement, it was still hungry. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. What did you do? Jeremiah's eyes met hers, hollow and filled with despair. I tried to seal it, to stop the horrors from escaping, but it was too late. The shadows had already claimed their victims, and I was cursed to live with the knowledge of what I had unleashed. Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. So the stories about people disappearing, about the house being haunted, it's all true? Jeremiah nodded slowly. Yes, and now that you're here, they'll come for you too. Before Amelia could react, the lights in the room flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. A low guttural growl echoed from the hallway, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. They're here, Jeremiah whispered, his voice trembling. The shadows, they've found us. Amelia's heart raced as she fumbled for her flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but what it revealed made her blood run cold. In the doorway stood a figure, its form shifting and writhing as if made of living shadow. Its eyes, empty voids, were fixed on her. Run! Jeremiah shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the deafening roar of the creature as it lunged toward them. Amelia barely had time to react. She sprinted down the hallway, her flashlight beam dancing wildly as she searched for an exit. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the whispers grew louder, echoing inside her mind. But as she reached the front door, something stopped her in her tracks. It wasn't fear or exhaustion. It was Jeremiah. He stood at the foot of the stairs, his eyes dark and hollow, a twisted smile on his lips. I told you not to come here, he said softly, his voice filled with a strange, unsettling calm. But now it's too late. Amelia backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. What are you talking about? Jeremiah's smile widened, and his eyes glowed with an unnatural light. You see, I wasn't just the victim of the curse. I was its keeper, the shadows. They needed someone to guide them, someone to bring them their prey. Amelia's blood turned to ice. You lured me here? Jeremiah nodded, his expression one of twisted satisfaction. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. The shadows are always hungry, and I've been feeding them for decades. The realization hit Amelia like a punch to the gut. She had walked right into a trap, and now there was no escape. The creature moved closer, its twisted form looming over her as she backed into a corner. Its whispering filled her ears, promising horrors beyond imagination. Amelia's hands trembled, her mind racing as the shadow closed in. The whispers grew louder, each one unraveling a new terror that threatened to consume her sanity. Amelia backed into the wall, feeling the rough, cold surface against her palms. There was nowhere left to run. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, and her vision blurred with fear. Jeremiah stood in the hallway, watching, unmoved by her terror, his face twisted in a grotesque blend of satisfaction and regret. "Why?" she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible over the growing cacophony of whispers. Jeremiah's smile faltered, his expression darkening with something resembling sorrow. "Because it's the only way," he murmured, his voice heavy with the weight of his own torment. "The shadows demand it. If I don't feed them, they'll take me." The shadowy creature loomed closer, its form rippling and shifting like smoke in the wind. Amelia could feel the cold emanating from it, a chill so deep it felt like it was freezing her soul. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, for something, anything that could save her. Her eyes darted to Jeremiah, who still stood motionless, his hollow gaze fixed on the scene before him. He had fed the shadows for decades, sacrificing countless lives to save his own. But for all the power he had gained, it was clear that he was nothing more than a slave to the darkness. A realization struck her. If Jeremiah was the one who controlled the shadows, maybe she could use that against him. "Jeremiah?" Amelia called out, her voice trembling but defiant. "You don't have to do this. You can stop it, end this nightmare. It's not too late." Jeremiah's eyes flickered with uncertainty for a moment, but then he shook his head, his face hardening once again. "You don't understand. The shadows are ancient, older than time itself. They cannot be stopped, only fed." Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as the creature inched closer, its featureless face inches away from hers. The whispers grew louder, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket of dread, but she refused to give in to the terror. She needed to buy herself more time to make Jeremiah doubt his choices. "I don't believe that," she said, her voice stronger now. "You've been feeding them for years, and yet here you are, still alive, still trapped. They haven't set you free. They never will." Jeremiah's expression faltered, the weight of her words sinking in. His hands shook as he looked down at them, as if realizing for the first time how frail and hollow he had become. "They'll consume you in the end," Amelia pressed on, her voice desperate but persuasive. "No matter how many lives you give them, they'll never let you go. You're just as much their prisoner as the rest of us." The creature stopped its advance, as if sensing the shift in the air. Jeremiah took a step back, his eyes wide with fear, not of the shadows, but of the truth in Amelia's words. "They don't want me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "They never wanted me. I was just a tool." The shadow hissed, its form flickering with rage, and Amelia could feel the intensity of its hunger. It was losing patience. "Do something!" Amelia shouted, her voice filled with urgency. "You can stop this!" Jeremiah's face twisted with a mixture of anger and despair. His whole life had been a lie, a life spent in service to a force that would never grant him the freedom he sought. For a brief moment, something changed in his eyes, resolve, a spark of defiance against the darkness that had ruled him for so long. With a deep, shaky breath, he stepped toward the shadow creature. "If you want to be free, then take me," he muttered, his voice trembling. "I'm done running." The shadow shifted, its attention now fully on Jeremiah. It loomed over him, the whispers turning into a deafening roar as it encircled him, pulling him into its suffocating embrace. Amelia watched in horror as the shadow consumed him, his frail body disappearing into the darkness. The last thing she saw was the look of peace on Jeremiah's face, a final moment of release as he was taken by the very force he had served for so long. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shadows retreated, shrinking back into the walls, the floor, and the corners of the room until the house was once again quiet. The air was still, and the cold presence that had haunted Blackthorn Manor for decades was gone. Amelia collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, her entire body trembling from the ordeal. It was over. Jeremiah had sacrificed himself to end the curse. But the question lingered. Was it truly over? The days following Jeremiah's disappearance were a blur for Amelia. She returned to town, shaken but determined to tell the story. The townspeople were stunned when she revealed what had happened. Some believed her, others didn't, but all of them agreed on one thing. Blackthorn Manor had always been a place of evil, and it was best left alone. But even as Amelia finished her article and prepared to leave the town for good, she couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered at the manor, something hidden deep in its walls. She had done her job, uncovered the truth behind Jeremiah and his dark legacy, but some doors, once opened, could never be closed. 2 weeks later, Amelia received a package in the mail. There was no return address, but when she opened it, her heart nearly stopped. Inside was a small, tattered journal, the name Alistair Blackthorn scrawled across the cover. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers trembling as they traced the edges of the worn pages. Then, with a deep breath, she opened it, her eyes scanning the faded, spidery handwriting. The first entry read, "The doorway is open again." A chill ran down her spine as she realized that Jeremiah's sacrifice might not have been the end. The shadows, the darkness, they were still out there, waiting, watching. And now they knew her name. Amelia left the town soon after, moving on to new stories, new places. But the memory of Blackthorn Manor never left her. The journal remained hidden in her desk drawer, a constant reminder of what she had seen and what still lurked in the shadows. She had thought she was free, but every now and then, late at night, she would hear the faintest whisper in the wind, a voice calling her back to the manor. A voice that reminded her that the darkness was never truly gone, and somewhere in the depths of Blackthorn Manor, the shadows waited patiently for their next prey.